The day dawned gray and cold, carrying with it the promise of change. From her window high in the Red Keep, Sansa Stark stared out over the sprawling city of King's Landing. The sky was draped in a shifting mantle of pale cloud, hinting at a sun that refused to show its face. She could hear the clamor of life beyond the walls. 1,000 voices raised in argument or laughter, the clang of iron horseshoes against cobblestone, the far-off chatter of gulls circling the harbor. Though she was still young, she felt impossibly old. One choice, one promise made by her father and sealed by her family, had rewritten the script of her life. Once, she had dreamed of romance. A noble prince on a white horse, wearing a golden crown, carrying her off to a gleaming castle. Once, she had loved the idea of Joffrey Baratheon. But that was before she truly knew him. When Lord Eddard Stark had accepted the betrothal of his eldest daughter to the crown prince, it had been done in good faith. The alliance between North and South would signify a new era of cooperation. Sansa had embraced it eagerly in her girlish fantasies, hearts dancing in her eyes. Then, everything changed when King Robert died. Suddenly, Ned Stark found himself named Hand of the King to Joffrey, who became king faster than anyone anticipated. And in the swirl of politicking that followed, Sansa found herself alone and frightened amid a court that disdained her, with a fiancé who alternated between cruel jests and sweet words, with courtiers who smiled even as they whispered behind her back. Still, the wheel of power turned. Her father was accused of treason and beheaded before her eyes. In another reality, she might have been freed. She might have gone back to the north with her family. But that other path shut the moment Joffrey decided that keeping a Stark bride would cement his right to rule and keep the north in thrall. Joffrey's mother, Queen Regent Cersei, insisted the marriage go forward. Lord Tywin Lannister saw strategic advantage. And as for Sansa's brothers, they were too far away, new burdens thrust upon their shoulders. She was alone, but she was also a Stark of Winterfell. Her father's death taught her a bitter lesson. Words of loyalty and duty did not protect you from the intrigues of King's Landing. Either you played the game or you became its victim. And so she swallowed her fear, even her grief, and forced herself to smile at the boy king who had mounted her father's head on a spike. Outwardly docile, she pledged herself to be the perfect little queen-to-be. Inwardly, she raged and grieved and plotted in the only ways she could. Each day became a test. Joffrey's malice, or the Queen Regent's manipulation, or the Lannisters' quiet threat overshadowed her every breath. But she learned. She listened. She discovered how to mask her real thoughts behind pretty courtesy. She recognized that in a world of lions, the wolf who bared her teeth too soon lost her head. So, she bowed her neck and bided her time. The wedding itself was a glittering affair. The Great September of Baelor was dressed in gold and red, with half-hearted touches of winter roses to represent the bride's heritage. Hundreds upon hundreds of lords and ladies crammed within to see the northern girl wed to the newly minted king of the Seven Kingdoms. She wore a gown of deep burgundy that might have passed for Lannister red unless one looked closely. Then the subtle motif of direwolves ran in silver thread across her sleeves and collar. A small rebellion, perhaps, but a rebellion nonetheless, for which she carefully avoided punishment by claiming it a tribute to her father's memory. The faith's high septon droned on with the proper vows. The air reeked of incense and candle smoke. Sansa could sense the power swirling around her, intangible yet oppressive as a thundercloud. The statues of the Seven seemed to stare down, impassive, as she gave her vow to take Joffrey Baratheon for her husband, to honor him above all others, to serve as his queen. And Joffrey, smug in his gold and crimson finery, placed the maiden's cloak over her shoulders, replacing the Stark colors with his own. The gathering burst into applause, bells pealed, and just like that, she was his. She would always remember how her voice shook when she said, "I do," and how her heart clenched with despair. She also remembered the vow she made silently in her own head. "I am a Stark of Winterfell. One day the North will rise again." They feasted until dawn. Sansa sat beside her new husband at the high table, forced to laugh at his jokes and nibble delicately on roast swan stuffed with onions and figs. Ladies in bejeweled gowns danced for the king's favor. Lords from across Westeros pledged their loyalty. There were jugglers, musicians, a flurry of spectacle. Yet through it all, a hush of tension reigned. It was too soon after King Robert's death, too sudden to forget Ned Stark's public execution, too precarious to ignore the rumors swirling through the realm. Robb Stark was rumored to have declared himself king in the north, even as Joffrey claimed the Iron Throne. The Riverlands were in open revolt under the Tully banner. Renly Baratheon in the south declared himself rightful king, and Stannis on Dragonstone insisted he was the legitimate heir. The War of the Five Kings, they whispered. Sansa was an unwilling pawn caught in the conflagration, a hostage queen to keep the north docile. Amid that swirl, she danced the first dance with Joffrey, letting him steer her across the polished floor. His hands were clammy and too tight on her waist. He smiled for the guests, bright and princely, but when his eyes flicked to her, they shone with the cruelty she had grown to know. In that moment, she wondered if this was her entire future. A life governed by his vicious moods, his hollow charm, and his mother's manipulations. But no. She resolved that if she must endure, she would find a way to claim a sliver of power for the Stark name. She dared to lock her eyes on the dais for a moment, where Queen Regent Cersei watched them with a faint, calculating smile. The Lannister matriarch had everything she wanted. Power, her daughter Myrcella betrothed to Dorne, her younger son Tommen next in line, her father Tywin as the hand of the king, and now the North's compliance, or so she believed. But Cersei was not the only one capable of cunning. Ned Stark's daughter might move more slowly, more cautiously, but eventually, the direwolf learned how to bite. So began the reign of King Joffrey Baratheon with Sansa Stark as his queen. They were crowned in a second, more solemn ceremony, with the people of King's Landing filling the streets. The crowds roared, though how much was genuine and how much coerced by the gold cloaks and Lannister soldiers was impossible to say. She could hardly see them from the top of the marble steps, squinting into the bright sun. The day was unbearably hot, sweat trickling down her neck beneath her heavy velvet gown, but she stood motionless as the crown was placed upon her head. A half-circle of gold set with a single purple gem at the center felt heavier than the heaviest chain. Joffrey, in his own crown of rubies, seized her hand and raised it for the crowd, eliciting another roar. The banners overhead snapped in the breeze. The royal stag entwined with the proud lion of House Lannister. Nowhere was the gray direwolf to be found. In the days and weeks that followed, Sansa busied herself with the formalities expected of a queen. Though the Queen Regent still walked the corridors of power, Sansa was paraded through feasts and audiences. She sat beside Joffrey on the Iron Throne, though not upon it, receiving the obeisance of lords, issuing empty proclamations that had been crafted by the small council. She tried to be the gracious hostess as foreign envoys arrived, always mindful of the way Cersei watched. The Red Keep was a labyrinth of politics. Spies lurked in every corner. Servants carried tidbits of gossip to Varys the Spider, who wore a knowing smile. Petyr Baelish flitted about as well, sometimes flattering her, sometimes ignoring her entirely, always with some private game in motion. When Tyrion Lannister returned to the city, designated by Tywin to act as the hand in his stead when the elder Lannister was off at war, he offered Sansa small kindnesses, kind words, subtle winks, or carefully couched warnings, but she did not know if she could trust him. He was a Lannister, after all, and the Lannisters had destroyed her family. Yet day by day, she learned how to move through these intrigues with a softer tread. She began to cultivate relationships, cautious friendships with certain ladies at court. Margaery Tyrell, once she arrived as Renly's widow, forging an alliance with Joffrey to keep the Tyrell might behind the throne. And the quiet, watchful Shae who was introduced to her as a new handmaiden, though Sansa suspected she was more than she seemed. Sansa adapted to the game of courtesy, gleaning scraps of knowledge from the rumors that abounded in the Red Keep. She did not forget the North. Word came in pieces that Robb had taken the field against the Lannisters, that he had defeated them in several battles, that the young wolf now wore a crown of iron and bronze. She sometimes wondered if he despised her for remaining with Joffrey. Did he consider her a traitor to the North? Then she would recall her father's last lesson. She had no choice but to survive. The moment she turned openly against her husband or tried to flee, her life would be forfeit. So she contented herself with slow, patient steps, forging alliances, gathering secrets, learning whom she might coax toward sympathy. If the day ever came when she could help her brother or further the Stark cause, she wanted the tools ready. Meanwhile, Joffrey's temperament grew no sweeter. The Lannister victory at the Blackwater, thanks largely to the timely arrival of Lord Tywin's forces and the cunning wildfire plans, kept Joffrey secure on the throne. Sansa remembered how, after that battle, Joffrey strutted about, proclaiming himself the greatest warrior in the Seven Kingdoms even though he had scarcely fought. That night, he had come to her chambers drunk on victory, stinking of wine and triumph. She had braced herself, but he had merely boasted for an hour, mocking his uncle Tyrion, calling him a coward, crowing that Robb Stark was doomed. Sansa, all graceful smiles, had congratulated him and played the part of the adoring wife. Inside, she felt a tremor of fury. The next day, she had bruises on her wrist where he gripped too tight when she tried to stand. But that was far from the worst that might have happened. Over time, Joffrey's appetite for cruelty turned outward again, focusing on hapless prisoners, on Tyrion, on whomever he believed had slighted him. But occasionally, Sansa saw his eyes flick to her with that old malice. She was not always safe. The only consolation was that Cersei was never far. Joffrey's mother seemed determined to keep Sansa from producing an heir too soon. Who truly ruled in the Red Keep, Sansa wondered. Joffrey was the king in name, Tywin the hand who wielded power, but in day-to-day matters, the Queen Regent's manipulations shaped everything. Sansa grew adept at flattery and watchfulness, for she had no illusions. The moment she crossed Cersei, 1,000 knives would turn against her. In this precarious existence, Sansa discovered something strange inside herself, a capacity for calm steel. She had always been gentle and dutiful, yes, but the enormity of what she had witnessed, the burden of wearing a crown at Joffrey's side, had sharpened her. Where once she would have wept privately until exhausted, she learned to quell her tears. Where once she would have clung to illusions of storybook chivalry, she now recognized how easily knights and lords could betray honor for power. Yet she also discovered the spark of pride in her own heritage. She was a Stark, and her father had taught her that the blood of the first men ran in their veins. She carried Winterfell in her heart. She would not bow to the Lannisters' cruelty forever. Someday she would carve out a victory of her own. Her chance came slowly and in pieces. As the war dragged on, resources in the capital grew stretched, and hunger began to bite at the populace. Joffrey's misrule led to resentment among the common folk. The Gold Cloaks patrolled the streets with brutal efficiency, stamping out any signs of unrest, but the tension smoldered. Meanwhile, Tywin fought in the field, trying to keep the fractured kingdoms under Lannister control. Robb Stark was rumored to be unstoppable in battle, capturing Harrenhal, forging alliances with the River Lords. The Iron Islands were causing chaos in the north, attacking the Stark homeland. In King's Landing, Tyrell gold and harvests from the Reach kept the city from starving, forging a necessary alliance. Margaery Tyrell arrived with her retinue, charming the people with her generosity. Cersei seethed at the Tyrell woman's presence but had no choice but to keep her close. Sansa found an unlikely friendship in Margaery Tyrell. The older girl exuded poise and intelligence. She had married Renly Baratheon briefly, so she was no stranger to royal politics. She treated Sansa with genuine warmth, or so it seemed. Sansa, wary of trusting too easily, still found herself leaning into Margaery's counsel. In hushed conversations, they spoke of the burdens of their positions. Margaery teased out small bits of Sansa's experiences with Joffrey. Sansa was careful not to speak out of turn, but Margaery's eyes glittered with understanding. She too recognized what Joffrey was. She asked delicately if he was kind. Sansa lied with a gentle smile. She was not yet certain if Margaery could be a true friend or simply a cunning foe. Still, the Tyrell bride-to-be soon became engaged to Joffrey's younger brother Tommen. No, that was an older rumor, overshadowed by new plans. Joffrey was to cast Sansa aside for Margaery, some said. Sansa's marriage was too tightly bound to the crown to break, but court gossip suggested that the Tyrells, flush with wealth, were pressing for Margaery to be Joffrey's queen. Instead, because Sansa was already married, that rumor never solidified. Margaery's own position changed, and soon the Tyrells found other paths to power, aligning themselves more firmly with the Lannisters in lesser ways. For the moment, Sansa remained the official queen. If the Tyrells wanted the throne, they would have to wrest it from Lannister control, or so it seemed. Sansa's presence as queen was a wedge. The North was still in open rebellion, but as hostage queen, Sansa's fate remained pinned in place. She almost wished Joffrey had cast her aside, but that too would have been dangerous. She was safer, ironically, with the title that kept her at the center of the game. When winter approached in earnest, the realm felt its bite. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Sansa found an odd comfort in the chill air that occasionally swept through King's Landing. It reminded her of home, of Winterfell's courtyards where she used to walk with her sister Arya, who was now missing, vanished somewhere out in the war-torn lands or beyond. She prayed for her family at every turn. She prayed for Robb's victory, for her mother's safe return, for Bran and Rickon who had vanished from Winterfell after the Ironborn took it. And she prayed, in her solitary devotions, for the strength to endure, to hold herself in readiness. These were dangerous prayers, yet it was all she could do. Despite the gilded finery of her new life, she was trapped in the Red Keep, a queen but also a prisoner. Joffrey's abuses waxed and waned. Some nights, he was content to ignore her, preferring to gallivant about the city with his Kingsguard, returning to their marriage bed in a drunken haze. Other nights, he demanded her presence, forcing her to watch him torment small animals or lesser courtiers. In private, he boasted of the men he had executed, the traps he had laid for Robb Stark. In public, he performed the farce of being a gallant king to his northern bride. For Sansa, it was a careful dance. She learned to nod in all the right places, to flatter him when necessary, to divert his attention when something dangerous hovered. It was exhausting, living on the edge of a blade each day. But she also discovered that the more she became a fixture of his reign, the more the people of King's Landing began to see her not only as Joffrey's queen, but also as the tranquil, softer face of the crown. She was the one who occasionally donated bread to the poor, who visited the orphans left after the battles, who treated the court ladies with courtesy. She saw the way Margaery also played that role. Yet Sansa had something Margaery did not: the hidden heartbreak that came from being parted from her home. The small folk, in hushed corners, began to pity and even admire her. That pity might eventually transform into a kind of loyalty, if nurtured carefully. Sansa had no illusions that it would overcome Lannister might, but she sensed that public perception was a currency of its own in the Game of Thrones. Still, every plan, every hope was overshadowed by the question of heirs. A king must produce a prince or princess. Joffrey made no secret of his impatience. Cersei pressed them gently, in that poisonous way of hers, to see Sansa pregnant. But in truth, the gods seemed to have withheld that possibility, or perhaps Joffrey's inattentiveness played a part. He was not always capable. His mood swung violently, and though he took her to bed often enough, there was a tension there, an anger that sometimes rendered him less than manly. Sansa endured each night, uncertain of whether to pray for a child that might secure her position or to pray for continued barrenness so that her lineage would not be so entwined with his. She could not deny that if she had a son, the Lannisters would have a complete hold on the North. It would be another chain around her family's neck. On the other hand, she sometimes thought that a child might serve as a shield or a bargaining chip, if she had the cunning to use it. At times, she wondered if Cersei was secretly dosing her with moon tea to prevent pregnancy until the time was right. Sansa had no proof, only suspicions. Everything in the Red Keep was shrouded in deception. One sultry day, she was walking the castle gardens, flanked by 2 Lannister guards and a pair of her own handmaidens. The sky was the color of an overripe plum, threatening a storm. She heard footsteps, glanced back, and saw Tyrion Lannister approaching. The imp, as many called him behind his back, gave her a polite bow. He was no friend, But of all the Lannisters, he seemed the least hostile. He had once tried to shield her from Joffrey's abuses during public gatherings. He offered her a small, rueful smile now. "Your Grace," he said, as if the words weighed on his tongue. "Might I have a word?" Her handmaidens glanced uncertainly at each other. Sansa hesitated, then nodded. Tyrion signaled the guards to remain a few steps away. He walked beside her down the garden path, where the heavy fragrance of lemon trees drifted between them. He cleared his throat. "I won't keep you long. I realize your time is valuable. But I wish to say, I know how lonely it can be here in the capital, especially for one from so far north." She gave him a serene smile, her mask firmly in place. "You are kind to concern yourself with me, my lord." His mismatched eyes flicked to hers. "Kindness has little to do with it, your grace. Practicality, perhaps more. We share an interest in seeing the realm kept stable. And sometimes, I suspect your interests may not align perfectly with those of my father or sister." She made no reply, only inclined her head, but her pulse quickened. He continued, voice soft. "I know you did not ask for this marriage. I know you lost your father under unfortunate circumstances. If there is ever anything I can do to help you navigate these difficulties, I hope you won't hesitate to send for me." "You forget, Lord Tyrion," she said gently. "We are on opposite sides of this war. My brother fights your house's armies. Our loyalties." He shook his head. "Please, your grace, I'm not so naive as to think we can be true allies. But I do know Joffrey. I know that one day he may push you too far. If that day comes, look for me in the shadows." A hush fell between them. Then he inclined his head, bid her good day, and turned to go. Sansa stared after him, her mind churning. She had never trusted Tyrion wholeheartedly, but she sensed that if there was a Lannister who might have a shred of honor or empathy, it would be him. Still, it was dangerous forging connections behind Joffrey's back. If discovered, she might be accused of treason. And yet, how else might she gain a measure of autonomy? Perhaps she should not dismiss Tyrion's offer too quickly. The next major event that shook King's Landing was the news that Robb Stark had been killed. Or so the rumors ran. Messengers brought word of a massacre at a wedding in the Twins, orchestrated by Walder Frey and the Lannisters. People whispered of treachery and black betrayal. The gruesome details came in fragments. Robb Stark, slain by crossbow bolts, his direwolf's head sewn onto his body. His mother, Lady Catelyn, murdered as well. It was said the Freys had turned cloak during a wedding feast. Joffrey exulted in the news, proclaiming it a stroke of genius by his grandfather. Sansa felt the world tilt beneath her feet. For days, she locked herself in her chambers, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, overwhelmed by grief. Robb was the heart of her family's rebellion, the young wolf, the hope for their independence. Now he was gone, and her mother too. Bran and Rickon were presumed dead or missing, and Arya had vanished long ago. Her entire family was shattered. She felt like the last living Stark, alone in a den of lions. Joffrey's sadistic glee rubbed salt in her wounds. He demanded a feast to celebrate the victory. He told her to wear her finest gown and sit at his side while the lords and ladies toasted the downfall of the young wolf. She did as commanded, tears burning behind her eyelids, forcing a brittle smile. When the minstrels played, Joffrey hoisted a chalice of wine and mocked the wolf howls. Lannister men cheered. Sansa felt her hands trembling in her lap, rage mingling with grief until she thought she would shatter. She wanted to scream at them, to claw at Joffrey's eyes, to tear the hall apart. But she remembered her father's lesson. She swallowed her tears, willed her face into stillness, and lifted her head with quiet dignity. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, Joffrey grasped her by the chin and sneered. "Your brother's head rots on a spike, my lady. Perhaps we should bring it here, decorate our mantle with it." He laughed cruelly. "You are no queen of the North now. The North belongs to House Bolton and House Frey, thanks to my grandfather's arrangement. You are only queen of what I allow you to be. Do you understand?" She did not dare reply. He shoved her and she stumbled, Her mind ached with hatred and sorrow, but outwardly, she still did not flinch or fight back. She simply lowered her gaze, biting her lip until she tasted blood. Joffrey stared at her a moment longer, expecting some reaction. When she gave none, he growled, stormed out, and slammed the door behind him. Sansa pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from sobbing. All her illusions of rescue, of Robb coming south to free her, were gone. She truly was alone. Except, the wheels of power shifted again, faster than she could have imagined. Tywin Lannister, flush with victory and believing the war nearly won, consolidated alliances. The Tyrells gained new honors. The Freys too. And Sansa? Her potential worth soared or plummeted depending on how you looked at it. She was a living link to the North, but the North no longer belonged to the Starks. Her name was a symbol, and in the complex web of alliances, symbols still had meaning. The Boltons, appointed wardens of the North, would not soon forget that the rightful blood of Winterfell still existed, even if wed to the Iron Throne. Some lords might look to her for leadership if ever the tide turned again. The realm was unsettled. Even with Robb Stark gone, there were challenges from other Baratheons, from the Greyjoys, from the Martells who whispered of revenge for Elia. Sansa's position might yet be crucial to the Lannisters' hold on power. She realized then that she could wield her heritage as a subtle sword. And so, in her darkest moment, she found a sliver of purpose. Life in the Red Keep continued under a veneer of normalcy. Tourneys were held. The lords feasted. The small council squabbled about taxes and the rising cost of the royal wedding debts. Sansa went through the motions, draped in silks and jewels, smiling her practiced smiles. But a shift had occurred inside her. With Robb gone, she had nothing left to lose but her own life, and maybe that made her braver. She stopped shrinking when Joffrey threatened her in public. She would not humiliate herself by begging. Instead, she bore herself like the queen she was supposed to be, evoking something of the cool steel of the North. Joffrey mocked her for it, but privately, she saw something like uncertainty flicker in his eyes. He had always relished her tears. If she denied them to him, he lost a measure of satisfaction. Not all days were fraught with terror. Sometimes Joffrey was preoccupied, and she found moments of quiet in the Godswood or in her solar. She took to inviting certain ladies to sit with her, Margaery Tyrell, who had her own complicated ambitions, and a few others who seemed sympathetic. She dispensed small kindnesses, paying special attention to any rumor. She listened for tidings of the North. She discovered that some of the northern clans, Umber, Karstark, Manderly, still clung to the idea of a Stark restoration. She gleaned hints that the Boltons' grip was tenuous, that the North remembered. The knowledge gave her a sense of faint hope. If ever a spark could reignite, perhaps she could fan it from within King's Landing. Her relationship with Cersei remained fraught. The older woman treated Sansa as a rival and an annoyance. Yet they were bound by a shared interest in managing Joffrey's impulses, at least in public. As the war dragged on and new threats emerged, Stannis was still alive, rallying forces in the Stormlands. Cersei found herself navigating the demands of her father, the Tyrells, the people, and the unsteady monarchy. That frustration often exploded at Sansa, sometimes in cutting words or humiliations at court. But Sansa bore them all with a demure courtesy, never rising to the bait. She suspected Cersei found that infuriating. On occasion, though, Sansa saw a glimmer of pity or regret in the Queen Regent's eyes. That was scarier than hatred. It meant that somewhere beneath her polished exterior, Cersei recognized that they were both captives of male power, albeit in different ways. Not that it softened Cersei's venom. She remained a lioness, protective of her cub and ready to tear out Sansa's throat if it served her purpose. Amid these tensions, Tyrion Lannister quietly rose in influence. Tywin left him more responsibilities. He managed the city's finances, negotiated with the bankers of Braavos, oversaw certain aspects of governance. As Hand of the King in Tywin's absence, he sometimes summoned Sansa to small council meetings that touched on matters of the North. He made a show of deferring to her counsel, though though it was largely symbolic. Nonetheless, these gestures earned Sansa a place at the table, if only a minor one. She listened carefully, gleaning the intricacies of politics, giving mild answers. Tyrion would watch her with that canny expression, as if testing how much she understood. Sometimes, he'd tilt his head in approval of her measured responses. She grew to appreciate his subtlety. She also learned that, while he bore the name Lannister, Tyrion was not beloved by his family. That precarious position might make him an unexpected ally. Still, she trusted him only so far. One evening, while reading in her chambers, she received a summons from Tyrion to meet on a secluded balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay. Nervous but curious, she went under cover of darkness, escorted by one lady-in-waiting who was promptly dismissed at the door. Tyrion stood there, leaning against the rail, the lights of the harbor flickering far below. He bowed slightly as she arrived, gesturing for her to stand beside him. "I must be mad," he murmured, "risking a private conversation like this, but I trust you're more discreet than Joffrey or my sister might believe." She clasped her hands before her. "What would you have of me, my lord?" He sighed. "Straight to the point. Very well. The news from the north is troubling for us all. Winter is coming, truly, and the lords there are resentful of Bolton rule, especially after the atrocities at the Twins. We hear rumors that certain clans might try to depose Roose Bolton in favor of, well, some other claim." Sansa stiffened. She had heard these rumors, too, though only through hushed whispers. "I see. I wanted you to know," Tyrion went on, "that it's not inconceivable the North might rise again. And if they do, your name, your presence on the throne could become a focal point of rebellion or reconciliation, depending on how it's handled. My father will want to crush any northern uprising, of course. But I suspect our wise Queen Regent might see a different path, maybe through you. Marriages, pardons, a show of leniency. All are possible if they serve the throne's needs." She felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. "Why are you telling me this?" He met her gaze. "Because one day soon, the realm might need you to broker peace with the North. Or the realm might find itself at odds with you, if you choose to cast your lot with those rebellious lords. I suppose I'm offering you a chance, small though it is, to direct your own destiny." She released a shaky breath. "And what destiny do you believe I want?" Tyrion shrugged. "To see your home restored, your people free of tyranny. I do not think you carry much love for Joffrey or my family, but I also know how precarious your situation is." He drummed his fingers on the balcony railing. "If you feel there's a moment to act, to steer the realm's policies towards something that benefits you and the North, you'd be wise to seize it. And if you need a quiet ally in the Red Keep, well, I stand ready." "Why?" she asked, voicing the question that had haunted her for months. "Why would you help me, if your own family stands to lose from it?" Tyrion's mouth twisted. "Because Joffrey on the throne is a disaster in the making. Because my father may be a brilliant strategist, but he is forging a legacy of fear and betrayal. And because I have no illusions about my place in this family. It might amuse me, in my own twisted sense, to see the North keep a measure of its pride, and to see you, my queen, outmaneuver those who underestimated you." Her heart pounded. She knew she was on the brink of something dangerous, yet a part of her longed to grasp any thread of agency. "I will keep your words in mind, my lord. I cannot promise anything, but if ever the time comes," he held up a hand, "that is all I ask. Now let us linger no longer. If we're seen together in secret, tongues will wag." And with that, he gave her a final bow and slipped away into the darkness. Days passed and Sansa resumed her routine, hosting ladies for tea, attending councils, all the while uncertain what to do with Tyrion's offer. She was not fool enough to trust blindly, but she could not ignore the sense that a door had cracked open. Deep in her bones, she felt that the North's discontent would not lie dormant forever. Perhaps she could harness it. Perhaps she could forge a path back to Winterfell's rightful rule. The question was, how? She did not wait long for the realm to churn anew. Stannis Baratheon, presumed to be regrouping in the south, suddenly launched an attack on King's Landing with new allies, rumored to be mercenaries from across the narrow sea. Panic gripped the city. Tywin was away dealing with uprisings in the Riverlands. The Gold Cloaks braced for another siege. Memories of the Blackwater haunted everyone. Joffrey strutted about, proclaiming he would crush his uncle. Meanwhile, the people whispered that Stannis had the righteous claim, that he was King Robert's true heir, not this incest-born abomination. Sansa watched fear spread like contagion. She also saw the flicker of possibility. In the chaos of a siege, perhaps a queen trapped in a golden cage might slip free. Or perhaps she could arrange a parley with the northern lords who might come to Stannis' side. The labyrinth of potential outcomes made her head swim. Stannis' ships appeared off the coast. The city braced for war. Sansa found herself once more in a swirl of strategizing. Joffrey insisted on leading the defense from atop the walls. Cersei demanded more men guard the Red Keep. Tyrion coordinated the city's defenses. The Tyrells hesitated, uncertain whether to commit fully. On the eve of the confrontation, Sansa walked the silent corridors, recalling the first siege. How she had prayed then for rescue. Now she prayed for clarity. Morning broke with the thunder of catapults and the crash of ships in the bay. From the walls, one could see Stannis' forces landing on the beaches south of the city. Joffrey barked orders while the Hound cursed at the flames. Tyrion scurried about, ensuring the wildfire traps were in place. Sansa, locked in Maegor's holdfast for her protection or imprisonment, could do nothing but pace. The city trembled with the roar of battle. She pressed her ear to the cold stone wall, imagining she could hear the screams of dying men. She had no love for Joffrey's cause, but she dreaded the bloodshed. She was so weary of war and death. Then, at midday, came news that a portion of Stannis' army had circled around to the North Gate, hoping to exploit a weakness. The Red Keep was abuzz with rumors that the city might fall. In that frantic atmosphere, Sansa realized no one was watching her closely. Cersei was nowhere to be found. Joffrey was on the battlements, posturing. Half the guards had been dispatched to key points around the city. Even her handmaidens had scattered in fear. Quietly, she slipped through a side corridor. A heavy cloak pulled over her hair. She did not even know where she was going, only that she had to do something, anything, beyond cowering in her room. Her feet carried her toward a certain tower where, rumor had it, a secret passage led down to the city's lower levels. She had overheard some of Littlefinger's men speak of it once. And once before, she had glimpsed the shadows of that hidden door. She thought perhaps she could find it again. Yet as she reached the tower steps, a figure detached itself from the shadows. Petyr Baelish stood there, arms folded. He smiled thinly. "Your Grace," he said, voice smooth as silk. What an unexpected encounter. Her heart lurched. "Lord Baelish, I was trying to find some peace to pray for the city. I am restless." And he placed a finger to his lips. "No need to spin tales, my sweet. War does put strange ideas in our heads. Might I guess you are searching for a way out? Or perhaps searching for something more subtle?" Sansa stiffened, fear flickering in her stomach. "I don't know what you mean." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I've known you since you were a little girl. I was quite fond of your mother, and I remain very interested in your future. But I must warn you, running off alone in the midst of a siege is unwise. If Stannis takes the city, your position might be precarious indeed. If Joffrey learns you tried to flee, well, let's not dwell on that." Her mouth felt dry. "I only wish to escape the madness. I'm so tired of all this violence." He touched her cheek gently, making her flinch. "Sweet child, the world is violent, and only the clever thrive. Now, if you desire freedom, I might help you for a price." She swallowed. "What price?" His smile turned feral. "Allegiance, influence. Perhaps, when the dust settles, you might find your way to me. I could take you far from this city, or I could install you in a position of power, depending on how events unfold. House Baelish might one day rival the greatest of houses, with the right alliances. And a queen, especially one tied to the north, could be most advantageous. Her skin crawled at the implication, but she realized this too was a door opening. Another path, full of dangers. Could she trust Petyr Baelish? He was cunning and unprincipled, but he had a knack for survival. And he had loved her mother in his own twisted way. Perhaps that might keep him from betraying her outright. The tower shook with the echo of a distant explosion. Sansa felt panic welling, yet she forced her voice steady. "If you truly mean to help me, then I will keep your offer in mind, Lord Baelish." He nodded as if satisfied. "Wise girl. Now off you go. Hide yourself away. This day promises to be decisive." He brushed past her, disappearing into the stairwell's gloom. Sansa remained for a moment, heart pounding. Then she fled, returning to Maegor's holdfast before anyone noticed her absence. That evening, the horns sounded. The city rang with confused shouts. Rumor spread that Stannis had been forced to retreat. Reinforcements from Highgarden had arrived unexpectedly, crushing his flank. The Gold Cloaks and Lannister soldiers had rallied, driving Stannis' army back to their ships. Word spread that the battle was over, for now, and King's Landing still belonged to Joffrey. A savage victory. Hundreds lay dead. Sansa was summoned to the throne room for the triumphant return of the king. She arrived to find Joffrey, bloodied but smug, strutting before cheering courtiers. Tyrion stood to one side, battered and exhausted. Margaery Tyrell had arrived, courtesy of the reinforcements her family provided. She was showered with praise for the Tyrells' timely intervention. Cersei looked relieved, though worn. Sansa tried to feign delight. She curtsied as Joffrey beckoned her forward. His eyes gleamed with triumph. "My sweet queen," he proclaimed, "your presence has brought me victory once more. Come, let us celebrate." Applause filled the hall, though many faces looked hollow. Another siege survived, but the realm was still far from peace. Yet Joffrey seemed drunk on victory. That night, he forced Sansa to attend a private feast for his key knights, where the wine flowed freely. Men boasted and roared, toasted the king, cursed Stannis, and praised the Tyrells. Joffrey leered at Sansa throughout, occasionally ordering her to recite some poem or sing a northern ballad. She complied, face burning, voice shaking. When the feast ended, he dragged her to his chambers. She braced for renewed cruelty, but Joffrey was oddly subdued. He babbled about the glory of battle, about how he personally had scattered Stannis' men, about how the North would yield to him now. She thought he must be half mad with the bloodshed and adrenaline. Eventually, he passed out, snoring in a drunken stupor. Sansa slipped away, trembling. Over the following weeks, King's Landing settled into a NSE calm. With Stannis repelled, the immediate threat was gone, but more storms brewed beyond the horizon. In the north, House Bolton governed by fear. Rumors of a bastard son, Ramsay Snow, reached Sansa's ears, telling of atrocities in Winterfell and the surrounding lands. She could scarcely bear to imagine what had become of her childhood home. Meanwhile, the Riverlands still simmered with discontent. The Ironborn continued their raiding, and the Tyrells, flush with their growing influence, pressed for Margaery to be recognized in some official capacity. The politics twisted further, but Sansa kept to her plan. Wait, watch, gather small alliances. She accepted Tyrion's courtesies, deflected Baelish's insinuations, maintained a facade of loyalty to Joffrey, and clung to her identity as a Stark beneath it all. Her moment of decision arrived on a night of swirling rumors. Word reached the Red Keep that the Iron Bank of Bravos had threatened to call in the crown's debts. Tension soared. Tywin demanded more taxes from already burdened lords. The city muttered and rumbled with complaint. Joffrey, always capricious, ordered the arrest of several merchants who dared to question the taxes. Protests erupted in the streets. The Gold Cloaks cracked down harshly. The pot was boiling, and Sansa felt that soon it would overflow. It happened in a rush. The next morning, as Sansa listened to a meeting of the small council, news arrived that House Bolton was facing an insurrection in the far north. The Umbers and the Manderleys had joined forces to retake Winterfell in the name of the Starks. With Robb gone, they had no clear Stark heir except rumor suggested Bran or Rickon might be alive. Some whispered they rallied in Sansa's name, though she was a captive queen. The Boltons sent frantic requests for help from King's Landing, but Tywin had no men to spare. Cersei declared that if the Boltons could not hold the north, they did not deserve it. Joffrey, bored by the matter, said he'd send a few troops eventually. Sansa's heart pounded. It was happening. The north was rising again. If they succeeded, they might throw off Bolton rule. But what would they do with her, Joffrey's wife, still draped in Lannister colors? She could not simply wait for the outcome of this revolt. She had to act. Quietly, she sought out Tyrion. She found him in his solar, poring over ledgers. He looked up, startled, to see her. She closed the door behind her, every nerve on edge. "Lord Tyrion," she said softly, "you told me once that if I ever needed your help, I need only ask." He set aside his quill. "So I did." She took a breath. "The North has rebelled again. If by chance they succeed in throwing out the Boltons, I would see them restore Winterfell and the Stark name. I want to help them. Somehow." Tyrion studied her face, his gaze unreadable. "That is treason." "Yes," she whispered. "It is. I ask you as one who has shown me more kindness than most. Will you stand aside if I move to help my people?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "You've chosen a dangerous path. If discovered, the Lannisters will show no mercy." Sansa's heart hammered. "I can remain a silent hostage, or I can do something meaningful. My family's legacy is all I have left." A faint, rueful smile curved his lips. "Your courage is commendable, Your Grace. Perhaps I can quietly divert certain resources, ensure that gold or supplies reach certain northern lords. I may have a contact or two, but this cannot be traced back to me." "Of course," she said, bowing her head. "I thank you. Someday, I will not forget this service." He nodded. "You are placing great trust in me, Sansa Stark." She felt tears threaten but blinked them away. "If I cannot trust you now, there is no hope for me." With that, she turned and fled, nerves on fire. She had done it. She had committed herself to aiding the North's rebellion. It was only a small gesture, the promise of some financial backing or subtle sabotage of the Boltons' requests for reinforcements. But perhaps it would help tip the scales in favor of her people. And if they won, if they reestablished Stark rule, would they remember she had played a part, even from within the Red Keep? She prayed so. Time crawled. Messages came from the North, conflicting. Some said the Boltons had crushed the rebellion. Others claimed the Boltons had retreated to the Dreadfort while the Umbers and Manderleys marched on Winterfell. The Red Keep seemed uninterested, more focused on other threats. Joffrey scorned the North as a worthless land of snow and traitors. Sansa maintained her facade, endured Joffrey's presence. She found strength in the knowledge she had done all she could. Tyrion gave her occasional nods, but never discussed specifics in public. Petyr Baelish watched her with a knowing smirk. She avoided him when she could. Then, late one night, a rider arrived from White Harbor, bringing word to King's Landing. Sansa only discovered it when a kitchen maid whispered that the rider had come battered and half dead, that he had demanded an audience with the king. At dawn, Joffrey summoned the court to the throne room. The messenger was dragged forward. He gave an account of how the Manderleys had joined with the Umbers, the Glovers, and other northern houses, reclaiming swaths of territory from the Boltons. Rumor suggested that young Rickon Stark had been found, a boy of 9, hidden by loyal bannermen. The assembled court gasped. Joffrey demanded details, raging that the Starks were all dead, that this was impossible. The messenger insisted that Rickon Stark lived, and the northern houses were rallying around the boy, proclaiming him Lord of Winterfell. The Bolton forces were pinned down. A final battle loomed. Sansa's heart soared at the revelation. Rickon, the wild little boy she remembered chasing cats in Winterfell's halls. Alive. She bit back tears, a flurry of hope and fear swirling in her chest. If Rickon truly had returned to reclaim his birthright, the north might be saved. Joffrey erupted in fury, calling for immediate action. Tywin was absent on campaign, so the king demanded that the Queen Mother muster troops to march north at once. Cersei tried to reason with him, saying that the crown could ill afford another campaign so far away. But Joffrey was adamant. "I will not have some northern whelp calling himself a Stark. I'll mount his head on a spike beside his brothers." He turned to Sansa, smirking. "How does it feel, my lady, to know you have another traitor brother to grieve?" She forced herself to remain composed. "If he truly is my brother, I pray he finds mercy from the crown, your grace," she said sweetly, her voice trembling only slightly. Joffrey sneered. "Your prayers mean nothing. I'll see him dead. Guards, seize that messenger and throw him in the dungeon. We'll force the truth out of him if it takes all the torturers in the city." The wretched messenger was dragged away, screaming. Sansa stood, heart pounding. The court was dismissed, murmuring in alarm. The war was not over, not by a long shot. The next move belonged to Joffrey and the Lannisters. In the days that followed, Joffrey ordered a large force to assemble. He named the mountain Ser Gregor Clegane to lead it north. Tyrion and Cersei tried to temper the plan, pointing out the difficulties of traveling so far in winter, but the Boy King would not listen. Sansa felt dread curdle within her. If the mountain reached the north, the brutality inflicted on her people would be unspeakable. She prayed the northern armies were ready, and she also wondered if any sabotage could be done here, in King's Landing, to delay that force. She found Tyrion, but he only shook his head. "I cannot hold back the tide forever. If the mountain musters men, they will march," he said grimly. That night, Joffrey came to her chambers, half drunk, flush with the thrill of commanding an army. She sensed his unstable mood. He paced around, ranting about how he would see the Stark line ended once and for all, how he would force Rickon to bend the knee and then kill him anyway. She sat rigid on the edge of her bed, fists clenched in her lap. Then he turned on her, eyes wild. "You and your entire family are traitors. I should have put you down long ago, but Mother insisted you were valuable. Now I see no use for you." Fear spiked. She tried to speak calmly. "I have only ever served you, my king." "Lies," he spat. "I see how you look when the North is mentioned. You long for them to prevail. Shall I put you in the black cells, too? Teach you to remember your loyalties?" She trembled but forced herself to remain still. "I am your queen, your grace. I serve you in all things." He snorted. Then, in a sudden lunge, he seized her by the shoulders. "You're a traitor's daughter, a traitor's sister. And now another traitor brother crawls out of the snow, flaunting the direwolf banner. I'll make sure he suffers." His fingers bit painfully into her arms. "Should I make you suffer in his place?" She choked back a sob. "I am your loyal wife." He stared at her, breathing heavily. Then, with a snarl, he shoved her onto the bed, pinning her down by the wrists. Her heart thundered in terror. But he was drunk, uncoordinated. She managed to keep her wits, lying still, letting him rage. Eventually, the wine and the adrenaline overcame him, and he collapsed onto the bed, passing out in a heap. Sansa lay there in the darkness, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. This had to end. She could not endure this monster forever. For a moment, she considered the daggers hidden in the room. She fantasized about plunging one into his chest, but that would mean her death almost certainly. She could not help anyone if she died. And so, with careful patience, she extricated herself from under him, summoned her handmaiden to help move his unconscious form to a comfortable position, and then went to a different chamber to find some semblance of rest. Within a fortnight, the mountain's host marched north. Sansa and the rest of King's Landing waited for tidings. None came for weeks. The city stewed in tension. Petyr Baelish vanished at some point, off on one of his mysterious journeys. Tyrion locked himself in endless meetings with the Gold Cloaks, trying to keep the city from chaos. Marjorie Tyrell hosted lavish feasts to appease the crowds. Cersei paced, unsettled by the unpredictability of Joffrey's decisions. Meanwhile, Joffrey grew more erratic. He was no longer satisfied with petty cruelties. He wanted grandeur, absolute power, the realm kneeling at his feet. He ordered extravagant building projects to honor himself, draining the treasury further. The city groaned under the weight of taxes. Anger festered. Sansa felt the air crackling with tension, like the moment before a storm. Then, one morning, ravens arrived. The North had repelled the mountain's forces. Rumor said a cunning ambush in the Wolfswood had trapped Gregor Clegane's men in a blizzard. Starving and freezing, they fell prey to hit-and-run strikes from northern scouts. Some said Wyman Manderley had used the gold that mysteriously came his way to hire sellswords skilled in mountain combat. Others said the old gods had intervened. Regardless, Ser Gregor was wounded and captured. His men were slaughtered or scattered, and the survivors carried the message that Rickon Stark now held Winterfell, with the support of multiple northern houses. For the first time in living memory, the North was close to returning to Stark hands, and Joffrey's attempt to crush them had failed. The fury that erupted in the Red Keep was volcanic. Joffrey howled for vengeance. Cersei tried to placate him. Tyrion kept silent, a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his mismatched eyes. Sansa felt a surge of triumph, though she concealed it behind a mask of careful neutrality. Privately, she let tears flow, tears of relief and joy. Rickon was alive. Winterfell was free. She murmured a prayer of gratitude, though she knew many battles lay ahead. This was a turning point. The North remembered, after all. That night, King's Landing erupted in riots. The small folk, emboldened by the Lannisters' defeat in the North, by the rising taxes and tyranny, poured into the streets. They shouted curses against Joffrey, hurled stones at the gold cloaks, demanded food and justice. Fires broke out. Chaos spread across Flea Bottom. Joffrey, in a rage, ordered the gold cloaks to cut down the rioters. Blood ran through the streets. Sansa watched the city burn from her window, numb. She remembered the earlier riot that almost cost her her life. Now, the city was convulsing on a larger scale. The Iron Throne was built on fear, and fear's cost was coming due. In the midst of this upheaval, Sansa glimpsed her path. Tyrion's help had been instrumental in the North's success. Now, the realm was fracturing further. If the Lannisters lost their grip on the capital, a new order might emerge. If that happened, Sansa Stark could be more than a hostage queen. She could hold a piece of the realm's future. In the swirling chaos, she felt the threads of fate converging. Perhaps the time had come to slip away from the Red Keep entirely, to seek safety in the Tyrell retinue, or to accept Petyr Baelish's earlier offer, or to find some other route back to the north. She did not want to remain by Joffrey's side if the city fell into anarchy. And yet, the next moves would be fraught with peril. A single misstep might be her end. Still, as she stood at the window, watching flames dance over the rooftops, she felt the beating of her own heart. She was alive. She was a Stark. The North had not forgotten its name, and a spark of possibility glowed within her. The Game of Thrones had taught her harsh lessons, but it had also revealed her hidden strength. She was no longer the naive girl with songs in her head. She was a woman tempered by loss and cruelty, wearing a queen's crown she despised but could still wield. And if the time was right, she would slip that crown from her head and replace it with the direwolf's mantle. Once the North was truly free. She knew not what the morrow would bring, only that she would greet it with open eyes and quiet resolve. The realm might be in flames, but from those ashes, the North and House Stark could rise once more. If she had to light the fire herself, she would. And when winter finally came to the south, she would be ready. She was Sansa Stark, and no matter how many times they cloaked her in lion's red, her blood ran true. The line of the Kings of Winter would not end with Robb's death. Another Stark lived. Another heir stood in Winterfell's halls. And she, a captive queen at the heart of the lion's den, would do all in her power to ensure that the North endured. In that dark, tumultuous hour, Sansa placed her hand on the cold glass of the window and whispered a silent vow that echoed her father's words. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies but the pack survives. She was no longer alone. Rickon, her people, her heritage. Somewhere out there, she had a pack again. The Lannisters might hold her body, but they would never truly hold her heart or her loyalties. And when the time was ripe, she would show them just how dangerous a cornered wolf could be. Sansa Stark could still feel the reverberations of that fateful night of riots echoing through the corridors of the Red Keep. The city had not yet calmed. Fires had burned into the early morning, charring entire rows of shops and homes near Flea Bottom. The gold cloaks, exhausted and battered, still roamed the streets in clumps, beating down any who so much as dared to raise their voices against the king. The tension throbbed in the air like an infection left to fester. By dawn, a thin, acrid smoke hovered over King's Landing, rising from scattered embers. Her bedchamber stank of sweat and fear, despite the perfumed rushes her maids laid out every morning to banish unpleasant scents. When she finally found a moment to stand on her balcony, Sansa pressed her palms to the cool stone and looked over the city. The faint light of the new day revealed a sprawl still trembling under Joffrey's wrath. The columns of the Red Keep caught the pale sun and glowed crimson, matching the Lannister banners that twitched in the breeze. Beyond the rooftops, Blackwater Bay reflected a dull gray sky, and above it all, almost out of sight, was a wisp of smoke from last night's devastation. Sansa let out a slow breath. The city was in chaos, yes, but there was a larger upheaval stirring in the realm, and part of that storm was of her own making. She had conspired, in her small way, with Tyrion to funnel some gold to the north. Their secrecy had paid off, and now Rickon Stark was rumored to be in Winterfell, rallying loyal houses against the Boltons. Somehow, miraculously, her wild younger brother had survived. Her mind reeled with the possibilities. She touched her fingertips to the new bruises on her wrist. Joffrey, in one of his rages, had pinned her down only hours before, promising to make her suffer if the North continued to resist. He had drunk himself insensible, threatening all manner of cruelties, before passing out. If the Northern cause gained even more ground, she knew her own position in King's Landing would become untenable. Perhaps it already was. But escape was not a simple matter. If she tried to flee and failed, her life and any chance to help the North would end in the Black Cells or on the executioner's block. Reluctantly, she turned from the balcony and went to ready herself for the day. Her maids, pale-faced and jumpy after the riots, helped dress her in a gown of ivory damask with golden trim, a garment Joffrey had ordered made for her. She detested how it flattered Lannister colors, but in the dangerous atmosphere of the palace, she had to appear docile. She let them arrange her auburn hair in braids around her head, the style worn by Southern queens in days gone by. When they finished, she offered a quiet word of thanks, schooling her expression into calm. Still, one maid, Danya, an older woman with quick eyes, lingered, seeming to want to say something. Sansa noticed and paused. "Yes?" Sansa asked gently. Danya bit her lip, glancing at the door to ensure it was shut. "I only wanted to say, I'm from the North myself, Your Grace. White Harbor many years past. If the gossip is true, and Lord Rickon is at Winterfell again." Her voice trembled. "I want you to know we haven't all forgotten the Starks." Emotion swelled in Sansa's throat. "Thank you, Danya," she managed. "I appreciate your loyalty." The woman nodded fiercely, then bowed her head and left quickly. Sansa stood there, touched by the maid's words. The North remembered. Even here, in the heart of the Lannisters' power, a few souls still silently pledged themselves to the Wolf Banner. It gave her courage. Moments later, Lannister guards arrived to escort her to the throne room. The day's royal audience was about to begin, and Joffrey demanded his queen at his side. Sansa went meekly, but inside her heart was pounding with a sense of dread and anticipation. She had no idea what fresh brutality or drama the day would bring. When they entered the throne room, she saw courtiers gathered in subdued clusters. Many averted their eyes. The previous night's violence had left everyone uneasy. Some whispered, no doubt having heard the rumor that House Bolton's defeat in the Wolfswood was more significant than initially reported. Sansa scanned their faces. Marjorie Tyrell, poised but watchful. Varys the Spider wearing an unreadable smile, Grand Maester Pycelle blinking rapidly as though confused by all the commotion, and off to one side, Tyrion Lannister, the only one who dared meet her gaze directly. He offered a minute nod, a gesture of both caution and acknowledgement. Then the herald banged his staff. King Joffrey lurched onto the Iron Throne, clad in shining crimson armor he had likely donned for show. His golden circlet glinted in the torchlight. As Sansa moved to her customary place just below him, off to the side, never on the throne itself, she kept her chin high. Tyrion's warning, Petyr's insinuations, the swirl of chaos outside the castle walls, all weighed on her. But she had become adept at hiding her turmoil. Cersei followed shortly, taking a seat near the throne with regal grace. 2 Kingsguard knights hovered on either side, their white cloaks stark against their polished mail. As the murmuring died down, Joffrey rose with a sneer. "My lords, my ladies," he began, voice ringing in the vaulted chamber. "You have seen the riots that broke out last night. Rabble in the streets dared to defy their rightful king. I would see them all flayed if I could." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Sansa saw the expressions of those before him: fear, resentment, or blank submission. Joffrey continued, "Ser Osmond of the Kingsguard informs me that some of those who incited the riot have been detained. They will be put to trial at once for treason and rebellion. Let that be a lesson to any who would oppose the crown." No one spoke, not even Tyrion. Joffrey stood a moment longer, letting the hush deepen. Then he smirked, as if enjoying their discomfort. "Good. Next order of business. The traitor lords in the north. I am told they have seized Winterfell, proclaiming the whelp Rickon Stark its lord, a boy who should have died with his brother. The crown cannot tolerate another Stark uprising." In the tense silence, Cersei added, "We have dispatched forces north, though they have encountered difficulties. We may need to reinforce their numbers in due time." Sansa sensed the flickers of panic beneath Cersei's calm veneer. The Queen Mother did not relish another major campaign so far from King's Landing, especially while the city smoldered with discontent. Sansa also noted how Tyrion fiddled with the pin on his lapel, the hand's badge, apparently deep in thought. Joffrey continued, "I will crush them, but for now we have more pressing concerns in the city. My loyal subjects quake in fear of ruffians and traitors. Let it be known I shall not rest until this rabble is put down. Any man found plotting treason shall lose his head. Any woman as well." His eyes flicked pointedly to Sansa, just a heartbeat of a glance. Her stomach nodded. Then Joffrey gestured at the herald. "Bring in the first petitioners." And so began another day's round of farcical governance. Merchants complaining of looting, minor lords begging for relief from the new taxes, the city bailiff describing the arrests made overnight. Joffrey dispensed commands with casual cruelty, ordering some individuals whipped, others stripped of property. At one point, a man sobbed that his family had been burned out of their home by gold cloaks who suspected them of insurrection. Joffrey merely laughed and told him that traitors brought their own fate upon themselves. Sansa stood in perfect stillness, swallowing back the disgust that threatened to twist her face. If she let even a flicker of pity show, Joffrey might lash out at her. So she trained her expression into that calm mask she had perfected, focusing on the flickering torches, the swirl of dust motes in the air, anything but the pleas of the desperate. The only moment of relief came when Tyrion interrupted to clarify some financial matter, countering one of Joffrey's more outlandish decrees. He pointed out that the city coffers could not sustain the new taxes on trade from Pentos, lest the merchants boycott King's Landing entirely. Joffrey bristled, but Cersei stepped in to side, if somewhat grudgingly, with Tyrion. Sansa glimpsed the boy king's flushed face, his knuckles whitening on the hilt of his sword. She worried he would lash out. Eventually, he relented, though not without a sneer. Tyrion offered a slight bow and resumed his place. Through it all, Sansa could sense Cersei's heightened frustration. The Queen Mother had once commanded the city's politics with her cunning and her father's unassailable might at her back. But with Tywin away and Joffrey more volatile than ever, her control was slipping. Tyrion, though nominally the hand, had diminishing influence over Joffrey's direct whims. The entire court teetered on a knife's edge. The audience concluded near midday, and Joffrey stalked off to hold a war council. Cersei followed, face set like a thundercloud. Most of the courtiers dispersed, eager to escape the tense atmosphere. Sansa took a step to retreat as well when she felt a gentle tug at her sleeve. She turned to find Margaery Tyrell, serene in a gown of pale rose, regarding her with concerned eyes. "Your Grace," Margaery said softly, "you look as though you could use some air. Would you walk with me in the gardens?" Sansa hesitated. This was the sort of invitation she would normally accept without question, especially when it came from the Tyrells, who carried considerable sway. But now caution tugged at her. Margaery was not her enemy, precisely, but she had her own ambitions. In this treacherous climate, Sansa could not blindly trust anyone. Still, Margaery had shown her kindness in small ways, offering compliments on her dresses or sharing whispered bits of harmless gossip that brightened Sansa's lonely days. Perhaps a few minutes of conversation might yield new insights, and Joffrey was too busy proclaiming his war plans to notice. "Of course," Sansa replied. "That would be lovely." They made their way through the Red Keep's corridors, accompanied by a pair of guards from the city watch. The tension among the soldiers was palpable. Each pair of eyes flicked nervously at every movement, as if dreading a fresh riot or attack. They reached the royal gardens, a series of shaded paths winding among lemon trees, jasmine, and scattered marble benches. The midday sun glimmered through the leaves, and a faint hint of salt air drifted from the bay. It should have been a scene of peaceful beauty, but Sansa's nerves remained taut. Margaery led her toward a stone bench near a small fountain. The sound of trickling water offered a soothing backdrop. The guards stood at a discreet distance, close enough to intervene but far enough not to overhear every word. Margaery sank onto the bench, arranging her skirts, and gestured for Sansa to join her. "How are you faring?" Margaery asked, her voice gentle. Sansa forced a small, polite smile. "I manage as best I can. These are difficult times for everyone." Margaery studied her face. Sansa had the impression the older girl saw more than she let on. "I won't pry. I only wished you to know that, despite these troubles, House Tyrell has every wish for a stable and peaceful realm. Our harvests feed the city. Our gold stabilizes the throne. We have no interest in open conflict with the North or any other region. War is costly. The Tyrells prefer alliances." Sansa nodded slowly, trying to parse Margaery's meaning. "I appreciate your willingness to keep the people from starving. Truly." Margaery looked down at her hands, the sunlight gleaming on the ring shaped like a rose. "I've heard rumor that your brother has retaken Winterfell. Forgive me, I do not mean to cause you pain." Sansa's heart squeezed. "The North is far away, and so much has happened there that I scarcely know what to believe. I only pray for the safety of the innocent. And for the rightful lords of Winterfell," Margaery said softly. It was not a question. She reached out and gently covered Sansa's hand with her own. "I know the official stance is that House Stark committed treason, and that the North belongs to the Boltons now. But in my heart, I still recall how Lord Eddard Stark once saved King Robert's life, how he served his hand. He was an honorable man. Not all of us have forgotten that." Warmth and sorrow coiled together in Sansa's chest. It was dangerous to speak so openly, but she felt a pang of gratitude nonetheless. "Thank you," she whispered. Margaery's eyes flicked to the guards, ensuring they were out of earshot, then back to Sansa. "Your Grace, Joffrey is not an easy king to serve. We both know that. I have told you before that House Tyrell seeks alliances, not strife. If ever you find yourself in need of support, I hope you will remember that the Reach stands as a bulwark against chaos. Do not hesitate to come to me." Sansa's mind raced. Another offer of help? Or was this just carefully disguised maneuvering, an attempt by the Tyrells to gain the Queen's ear and thus a foothold in the North if Joffrey's reign crumbled? Could be both. Yet Margaery seemed sincere, her voice bearing the ring of genuine concern. Sansa felt a sudden longing to trust her. She recalled Margaery's own precarious position, once married to Renly Baratheon, who had named himself king, then widowed, then reabsorbed into the Lannister alliance in a swirl of political deals. She, too, understood the precarious vantage from which women in Westeros often viewed power. "I will remember," Sansa said, her voice catching. "Truly." Margaery nodded, then gave her hand a final squeeze before rising. "We should return to the castle, lest the Queen Mother wonder what plots we spin." Her tone was lightly teasing, but Sansa caught the edge beneath it. They walked back under the watchful eyes of the guards. Sansa's thoughts churned. First Tyrion, then Littlefinger, and now Margaery. She had more potential alliances than she once believed, but each came with strings attached. House Lannister was fracturing, the city roiled with unrest, and the North was in open rebellion against its imposed overlords. The realm teetered, and she stood at the center, a precarious pillar upon which the illusions of unity were built. She had to be careful. One misstep and she might fall along with the entire structure. Upon reaching the Red Keep, she parted ways with Margaery and ascended to her solar. Her mind drifted as she climbed the winding stone steps, so she was startled to find Petyr Baelish, Littlefinger himself, awaiting her at the top of the corridor. Two of his men stood nearby, but he waved them back when he saw her approach. "Lord Baelish," she managed, trying not to betray her sudden jolt of apprehension. He gave a small bow. "Your Grace, a pleasure as ever. I was hoping to have a brief word, if you are not otherwise engaged." Sansa suppressed the urge to sigh. She was weary of clandestine conversations, but she could not afford to alienate him. Petyr Baelish was a cunning player in the game, holding the purse strings of the royal finances at times, and enmeshed in half a dozen secret dealings. "Very well," she said quietly. "Shall we speak here?" He looked down the corridor, where a pair of Lannister guards stood at attention, then back at her. "I was hoping for somewhere more private." He gestured with a tilt of his head to a small side chamber, a disused solarium with dusty windows overlooking the sea. She steeled herself and led the way, motioning the guards to wait outside. Inside, the air smelled of old stone and salt. A single tall window cast a beam of sunlight across the floor. Petyr closed the door gently, then turned to Sansa with that thin, unreadable smile he often wore. "My dear Sansa," he said softly, "I must congratulate you on maintaining your composure in these difficult times. Joffrey's temperament seems to worsen by the day." She said nothing, waiting. He raised an eyebrow. "The city roils. The North stirs. The Tyrells grin like cats. A lesser woman might be crushed by the weight of it all. But you, I see the steel in your spine." She wondered what game he played now. "You flatter me, Lord Baelish. I speak the truth." He paced a slow circle around her, his boots echoing on the floor. "You may recall I offered you an avenue of escape. I meant every word, but the moment must be right." He paused, studying her. "Have you given it thought?" She drew a breath. "I have considered many things, my lord, but you must understand, my position remains complicated." He chuckled, a low sound. Complicated is a polite word for being a hostage queen to a boy king who may soon bring the city to ruin. "Sansa, I know that your heart is with your family in the north. If indeed your brother Rickon has reclaimed Winterfell, I imagine you burn to join him, or at least ensure that the Stark's name lives on in freedom." She felt her throat tighten. "Yes," she whispered, "but escaping King's Landing is no simple matter. Joffrey and the Lannisters have eyes everywhere." A gleam of satisfaction crossed Petyr's face. "Indeed, but not all eyes see everything. The city is large, the guards are prone to bribes, and I have resources. If I can whisk you out of the city and onto a ship bound for, say, Gulltown or White Harbor, you could vanish under the right circumstances." Sansa's heart pounded at the thought. "You could do that? Now?" He lifted a finger. "Timing is everything, my dear. The city is still reeling from the riots. Joffrey has ordered strict lockdowns at the gates, searching each cart and traveler. until we find a moment of maximal distraction, or until your enemies are so busy fighting each other that they won't notice your absence. You're safer waiting. But I want you to be ready, should I send word." Her mind flicked to Tyrion's earlier caution, to Margaery's gentle overture. Whose help was genuine? Whose was self-serving? Likely all of them wanted something from her. "If I leave, Joffrey will suspect someone helped me," she said carefully. "I do not wish to bring retribution on my friends." Petyr's lips curled into a mocking half-smile. "Friends? My sweet, in King's Landing, it is best not to rely on that word overmuch. But you needn't fear. I am quite adept at covering my tracks. Let the Lannisters turn on each other, or on the Tyrells, or on the small folk. I know how to slip away unnoticed." Her stomach churned. "And what do you want from me if I go?" Petyr's eyes glittered. "Someday, I may call upon your gratitude. Perhaps, if the North stands free again, a certain alliance with House Baelish would be mutually beneficial. It is hardly unusual for a royal or noble house to reward faithful service, is it?" She exhaled shakily. "No, I suppose not." He stepped closer, too close, and lowered his voice. "Keep this in mind. Joffrey might decide on a whim to rid himself of you. You are valuable as a political pawn, but if the North can't be forced to bend the knee, or if the Lannisters deem you more trouble than you're worth, you could lose your head. It's not a fate I wish upon Catelyn's daughter, so do consider my offer." Sansa pulled back slightly, unsettled by his nearness. She forced a small nod. "Thank you, Lord Baelish. I will consider it." "Good." He lingered a heartbeat longer, then stepped away, smoothing his doublet as if to regain his polished composure. "I should return to my duties. Another riot might break out at any moment, and chaos is, well, I've always found it to be an excellent ladder." He bowed, an oddly theatrical gesture, then slipped out the door. Sansa sagged against the wall once he was gone, her breath unsteady. The net of intrigue tightened around her from every direction. She was being pulled in multiple ways. Tyrion's covert assistance, Margaery's gentle sympathy, Petyr's promise of escape. And always looming was Joffrey, a cruel boy king with a hair-trigger temper, who might kill her if he sensed the slightest betrayal. She closed her eyes, reminding herself of that vow she had made, to endure, to protect the spark of the Stark line, to help the North when she could. It was late afternoon when she finally returned to her chambers, exhausted from too many encounters and too much tension. She sank into a chair, letting her hands fall to her lap. Outside, she heard the distant clamor of the city. People trying to rebuild or salvage what was left after the riots, gold cloaks patrolling, a general unease hanging like a pall. She half wished she could vanish from sight entirely. Shae, her new handmaiden, whom Tyrion had once suggested might be helpful, entered quietly with a small tray of spiced wine and bread. "You look like you need to rest, milady," Shae said, her accent carefully modulated from what might once have been a lower-class lilt. Sansa managed a wan smile. "Thank you, Shae. Have you heard anything? Any new rumors on the streets?" Shae pursed her lips. "Only that people are angry. Some say the king is a demon in a boy's skin. Others blame the Lannisters for all the hunger and violence. They say the new taxes are ruinous. And more quietly, some say that if the Starks are rising in the North again, that's a sign the realm might have a chance." She gave Sansa a sidelong glance. "You didn't hear that from me." Sansa sipped her wine, the spice warming her throat. She wondered if it was wise to speak freely around Shae. There was always the possibility that Shae reported back to Tyrion, or even to others. But for the moment, she felt too weary to maintain her usual guard. "Thank you," she murmured. "That will be all." Shae curtsied and stepped back. A flicker of sympathy shone in her dark eyes before she left, leaving Sansa alone with her thoughts. She had taken only a few bites of bread when another rap came at the door. Light and quick, Sansa braced herself, unsure who else might intrude upon her day. "Come in," she called, sliding the bread aside. To her surprise, it was Tyrion Lannister himself, the Hand of the King, looking haggard. His doublet was rumpled, and there were faint purple circles under his mismatched eyes. He offered a small bow. "Your Grace, forgive my intrusion. May I have a moment of your time?" She stood, smoothing her skirts. "Yes, of course." He glanced around. "Are we alone?" She nodded. "Only you and I." Shay just left. At that, Tyrion relaxed slightly. He walked to the window, the late afternoon sun outlining his short form. "I won't keep you long, but I thought you deserved to know that the Iron Bank of Bravos is breathing down our neck again. They threaten to call in the Crown's debts if we continue this extravagant approach to governance." He gave a dry laugh. "Even with the Tyrell gold, the war, the palace expansions, Joffrey's vanity projects, it's all pushing us toward ruin. And now the city is half in flames." Sansa folded her hands. "I see. That is troubling." Tyrion let out a weary sigh, turning to face her. "We're teetering on a precipice. If the bank withdraws its support, the Lannisters will be forced to exact even harsher taxes to keep the army fed, which will lead to more riots. It's a vicious cycle. And in the north, the Boltons can't hold if the other houses unite behind your brother." He paused, meeting her eyes. "You may have heard that I used some of the gold from the treasury for expenses that remain, shall we say, undisclosed. It seems to have made a difference in the north, as you hoped." She felt a flutter of gratitude. "Thank you." Tyrion waved it off. "It's a small measure in the grand scheme, but it has borne fruit. Roose Bolton is said to be holed up in the Dreadfort, sending out pleas for Lannister reinforcements that either can't or won't arrive. That leaves Rickon Stark, if it truly is Rickon, in a strong position." She couldn't help a slight tremor of excitement. Then the North might truly return to Stark rule. "Possibly," Tyrion conceded, "though the boy is young and here's the matter of the Ironborn prowling the coasts. The region is hardly at peace. But for now, it's not as firmly in Lannister hands as my father once believed. I suspect he'll be furious when he returns." Sansa's pulse quickened at the mention of Lord Tywin's return. That would change the balance in King's Landing yet again. Tywin Lannister was cold, ruthless, and brilliant. He had orchestrated the Red Wedding. He would not hesitate to crush her or the North if it served his ends. "When is he expected?" she asked. Tyrion shrugged. "No one's certain. He was in the Riverlands, finishing off the remnants of the Tully and Stark loyalists there. Now he must weigh how best to address these fresh uprisings in the north. Perhaps he'll march his army there directly, leaving King's Landing to my sister and Joffrey." His mouth twisted wryly. "Or perhaps not. The realm is a patchwork of half-solved crises. Father can't be everywhere at once." Sansa nodded, thinking quickly. "If Lord Tywin commits to another campaign in the north, that will be terrible for both sides. More bloodshed." Tyrion grimaced. "It will indeed, but war rarely heeds the cost in lives. My father's only concern is restoring Lannister supremacy. And if Joffrey keeps alienating our allies, who knows how many more men Father might need to conscript." Her gaze drifted to the window. Across the city, the gloom of smoke still hovered. "I suppose we can only wait," she murmured. "Wait and see where the next blow falls." Tyrion studied her. Then he spoke in a softer tone. "Your Grace Sansa, if things continue to deteriorate here, if the small folk revolt or Stannis tries again, or if Joffrey does something foolish, you might need to leave quickly. I can't shield you forever. He might turn on me as well." Her heartbeat kicked up a notch. "I understand, but do you truly think that time is so near?" He sighed. "These events can accelerate very suddenly. I urge you to be ready. If you see your chance, take it. I'll do my best to misdirect the gold cloaks if you decide to flee." A flicker of confusion shot through her. This sounded very much like Petyr's proposition, but with less self-interest. Tyrion was plainly telling her to protect herself, even if it meant making Joffrey look a fool. She struggled to find words that expressed both gratitude and the fear that churned inside her. "I thank you, Lord Tyrion. You have been kinder to me than I expected from any Lannister." He gave a small, rueful bow. "My family is not renowned for kindness, I know, but we each do what we must to survive. In my case, that includes saving you from a fate you don't deserve, if I can." With that, he offered a half-smile and made to leave. But then he paused at the door, glancing back. "You're stronger than you know, Sansa. Your father would be proud." Her eyes brimmed with tears she refused to let fall. By the time she steadied herself, Tyrion was gone, the door clicking softly behind him. That night, Sansa slept fitfully. Dreams of Winterfell, warm halls, flickering hearths, melted into nightmares of Joffrey's sneering face. She dreamt of Rickon, alive and free in the ancient castle, only for Bolton men to drag him away. She dreamt of 1,000 crossbow bolts flying in the great hall. She dreamt of the Iron Throne dripping blood. She woke more than once, heart racing, the torchlight from the corridor casting eerie shadows on her walls. Each time, she sank back into restless slumber, haunted by images of death and wolves howling in the dark. She was still exhausted come morning, but events would not slow for her weariness. Word arrived that fresh riots had broken out in Flea Bottom, sparked by Joffrey's command for heavier punishments on anyone deemed treasonous. The Gold Cloaks had responded with brutality, which only stoked the anger further. Dozens lay dead. Shops had been looted. Some of the city's wealthier merchants, fearful of the continuing violence, boarded ships in the night and fled to Pentos or Bravos. The city was hemorrhaging people and resources, and each departure cut deeper into the crown's tax revenue. Cersei summoned Sansa to the Queen's solar mid-morning, presumably to discuss some queenly duty or public show of unity. Sansa obeyed, steeling herself. She disliked meeting Cersei in private. The Queen Mother's moods ran from cunning politeness to seething wrath, often without warning. Today, she found Cersei seated at a table strewn with maps and letters, a goblet of wine in hand. A pair of Lannister guards stood discreetly against the walls. "There you are," Cersei said curtly when Sansa entered. "Close the door and come look at this." Sansa complied, moving to stand beside the table. She saw a map of King's Landing with various districts marked in bright red. "Your Grace," she said softly, inclining her head. Cersei stabbed a finger at the riot-torn neighborhoods. "Look at this. The city is fraying. The Watch can barely contain the unrest. We're in a tinderbox." Sansa chose her words with care. "Times are difficult. Perhaps if more food and assistance were provided to the small folk, they might." Cersei's derisive laugh cut her off. "Food and assistance? You sound like Marjorie Tyrell, playing the gracious queen. But we have limited supplies, thanks to the war. And that whelp Stannis still hovers like a vulture, waiting to strike when we're at our weakest. The Tyrell harvests alone won't feed every beggar who chants for the Starks or for Stannis." Sansa lowered her gaze, letting the rebuke pass. Cersei took a sip of wine, then fixed her with a piercing stare. "It does not escape my notice, girl, that every time the North is mentioned, you go pale as milk. Are you hoping your traitor brother will march down and rescue you?" Sansa's stomach clenched. "Of course not, Your Grace. I only wish for stability in the realm." Cersei's lips curled. "Lies. You reek of northern sentiment no matter how you try to hide it. Perhaps you believe little Rickon Stark's success in Winterfell will free you from my son's yoke." She leaned forward, voice dropping to a hiss. "Let me assure you, no matter what your precious wolves do, we are not finished. My father will crush them if it comes to that. And if you dare betray us, if you even dream of betraying us, I will personally see your head on a spike beside your father's." Fear jolted through Sansa, but she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. I understand, Your Grace." Cersei exhaled heavily, as though the outburst had drained her. She set the goblet down. "Good. Now, Joffrey is determined to hold a court function in 2 days' time, a show of strength to quell rumors that the crown is weak. You will attend, of course, wearing your finest. We'll feed the highest lords and keep them loyal with flattery and spectacle. A foolish waste of coin, in my opinion, but it may placate some of the more fickle hearts." Sansa hesitated, then nodded. "As you command. May I ask what my role should be?" Cersei waved a dismissive hand. "Stand at his side, smile like a pretty little ornament, and do not speak unless called upon. That is all that's required of you." Sansa's cheeks burned at the humiliation, but she lowered her head. "I will do as you wish." "Good," Cersei snapped. She stared at Sansa a moment longer, her green eyes narrowed. Then, in a tone laced with something akin to pity, she added, "This is no place for a girl of your innocence. I almost regret how fate has cast you here, but do not mistake me. I will do what must be done to protect my son, no matter the cost." Sansa, unsure how to respond, simply bowed her head. A heartbeat later, Cersei dismissed her with a gesture. Sansa hurried to the door, her heart racing. Once outside, she sucked in a steadying breath. Every time she spoke with the Queen Mother, she felt she had survived a dance on the edge of a sharp blade. Today was no different. She spent the hours leading up to the feast in a kind of numbed anticipation. The city reeled from daily unrest. Joffrey roamed the Red Keep with grandiose threats, rarely listening to Tyrion or anyone else. The gold cloaks grew more brutal, but the king's command for a public display of courtly finery stood. So preparations began. Cooks labored in the kitchens, scribes wrote invitations, musicians tuned their instruments. Meanwhile, more stories trickled in of the North's success in ejecting Bolton loyalists from old castle keeps. It seemed each day brought fresh rumors of victories for the Stark cause. Sansa's hope swelled, yet so did her terror. She dreaded Joffrey's reaction if the North fully reclaimed its independence. Would he kill her outright in revenge, or use her as a hostage in some twisted negotiation? The day of the feast dawned overcast, a hint of rain in the air. Sansa dressed in a gown of shimmering gray-blue, an homage to the Stark colors that she hoped would not be too obvious to draw Joffrey's ire. Subtle silver direwolves were stitched along the hem, but from a distance, they resembled curling vines. Her hair was braided into an elaborate coil around her head, pinned with tiny pearls. She felt like a doll being prepared for display, but she forced herself to remain composed. She practiced the demure smiles in her mirror, reminding herself she would survive the evening through courtesy and caution. At dusk, the great hall filled with lords and ladies from across the crownlands, a scattering of Reach nobility, and a few foreign dignitaries brave or foolish enough to stay in the city. The high table was decorated with gold cloth and tall candles. Joffrey presided from the center, wearing a suit of gilded armor for dramatic flair, his crown perched at a jaunty angle on his golden curls. Cersei sat to his left, her expression cool. Tyrion was further down, with a resigned look on his face. Margaery Tyrell was present at a separate table with her attendants, though she flashed Sansa a sympathetic smile as Sansa passed. Sansa took her seat to Joffrey's right. There was no throne for her, merely a cushioned chair that matched the color scheme of the decor. The hall buzzed with forced merriment. Jugglers capered, a troupe of minstrels began a lively tune, and servers bustled with trays of spiced wine, honeyed duck, and roasted boar. Yet beneath the veneer, tension simmered like a covered pot on the verge of boiling over. Joffrey launched into boastful proclamations about how he had quelled the riots, how the northern rebels would soon be crushed. He recounted exaggerated tales of his own bravery during the defense of King's Landing against Stannis' fleet, as though he alone had saved the city. Courtiers cheered on cue. Sansa sat stiffly, picking at her food. She forced a serene smile whenever Joffrey glanced her way. Occasionally, he demanded she agree that he was the greatest warrior in the Seven Kingdoms. She would nod and murmur a perfunctory compliment, her stomach twisting at the taste of the lie. Margaery Tyrell, from her vantage, orchestrated small acts of kindness, calling for a cask of wine to be sent to a group of riverlords who had lost property in the war, praising the beauty of a minor lady from the Stormlands who appeared timid and out of place. It was a display of charm that some found endearing, others suspicious. Sansa watched, silently marveling at Margaery's ability to win hearts with a few deft compliments. At one point, as the feast wore on, Joffrey beckoned a minstrel forward, a trembling man with a lute. "Sing us a song about the valiant King Joffrey slaying the usurpers," he demanded, slurring slightly from too many cups of wine. The minstrel bowed and tried to improvise a flattering ballad, praising the lion and the stag, avoiding any mention of the wolf. But Joffrey's mood soured. "That's dreadful," he snapped. "I want a better song. Something mocking the traitor Starks. Comedic tune. Now." The minstrel blanched, stammering that he had no such composition prepared. Joffrey's eyes narrowed. "Then you are useless." He made a sharp gesture. "Take him out and teach him a lesson in the yard. Maybe he'll learn to sing better with a few broken fingers." Horrified, Sansa opened her mouth to protest, but caught herself. Several gold cloaks seized the minstrel, who wailed as he was dragged away. A hush fell over the hall, broken only by the clang of armor and the minstrel's fading cries. Then, as if to break the tension, Marjorie stood and led a toast to the crown. The crowd responded, glasses raised, and conversation slowly resumed. Sansa felt sick to her stomach. This was Joffrey in one of his more temperamental nights. She dreaded what else he might do before the evening ended. Sure enough, not an hour later, Joffrey was on his feet again, a chalice in hand, calling for attention. His cheeks were flushed, either from wine or from the thrill of cruelty. "My lords and ladies, I propose a grand spectacle to liven the night. Bring forth the dwarfs." A hush of confusion swept the hall. Moments later, a side door opened, and a group of dwarfs in motley costumes scurried in, each wearing masks representing the various kings of Westeros. One was Stannis, another was Renly, another was Robb Stark, and so on. The dwarf who wore the Robb Stark mask also had a wolf's pelt draped over his shoulders. Joffrey chortled. "We shall watch the War of the Five Kings on a small scale. Fight!" Dwarfs. The dwarfs, all looking terrified, began a mock battle with wooden swords, stumbling around the floor, occasionally squeaking taunts. Joffrey howled with laughter, while some courtiers chuckled nervously. Sansa, swallowing revulsion, forced her face into a neutral mask. She could not bear to watch the dwarf in the wolf pelt flail around, mocking Robb's memory. If she had her way, she would flee the hall. But she dared not. After a few minutes of this demeaning farce, the dwarf in the Stark mask was killed, to Joffrey's roaring delight, and the dwarf in the Stannis mask was unmasked, revealing a frightened man who pleaded for mercy. Joffrey declared the entire show a farce of traitors, and demanded the dwarfs be thrown out. The crowd erupted in forced laughter, trying to appease him. Sansa swallowed back her rage, her nails digging into her palms beneath the table. Finally, the feast began to wind down. Lords and ladies left in small groups, some stiff with apprehension, others eager to forget what they had witnessed. Joffrey lingered, regaling a cluster of toadies with slurred threats about how he would go north himself to kill the boy Lord Rickon. Sansa sat quietly, staring at her untouched goblet. She prayed for the night to end without further cruelty. At last, Joffrey turned to her, eyes glittering. "Come, my queen, we are retiring. You will walk with me to our chambers." Her pulse raced. "Yes, your grace," she said softly. He seized her by the arm, not painfully yet, but firmly enough to make a statement, and led her through the corridors, flanked by 2 Kingsguard knights. His steps wavered slightly from the drink, and Sansa realized how drunk he truly was. She prayed the gods might spare her from his worst impulses tonight. At the chamber door, he dismissed the Kingsguard, then shoved Sansa inside. She stumbled, catching herself against a table. "Lock it!" Joffrey barked at the door. The knights obeyed, the sound of metal sliding into place reverberating through the room. Sansa's heart pounded. She turned to see Joffrey swaying on his feet, a twisted grin on his face. "They all think I'm just a boy," he muttered, "but I'm their king. They fear me. I can do whatever I like. No one can stop me. Not my mother, not my worthless uncle, not the Tyrells, no one. And certainly not the Starks." He lurched closer, grabbing her chin. "Isn't that right, my lady wife?" She forced herself not to flinch. "Yes, your grace." He snorted. "Your eyes say otherwise. You think your little brother can save you? Huh? Maybe I'll kill you and send your head to him instead. Wouldn't that be rich?" Her pulse hammered so loudly, she feared he could hear it, but she had learned not to cry or protest. That would only spur him on. She stayed silent, letting him rant. But something in her silence enraged him further. He shoved her hard, and she fell back onto a chair, nearly toppling it. "Speak. If I want you to beg, you'll beg." Trembling, she forced words out. "Please, my king, have mercy." He let out a hoarse laugh, stumbling forward. "Mercy? Mercy? Starks get no mercy." He slapped her across the cheek, not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to sting and make her eyes water. She suppressed a cry, blinking rapidly. Blood roared in her ears. She was thrown back to the memory of her father's death, the sickening sense of helplessness. Could she fight him? Could she run? Her eyes flicked to the locked door. Even if she somehow bested Joffrey, she'd never escape the Kingsguard outside. She was trapped. He slapped her again, this time on the other cheek, spittle flying from his mouth. "Beg me not to kill your brother, or I'll hit you again." Her vision blurred with tears. She clasped her hands to keep them from shaking. "Please, don't kill him," she whispered brokenly. "He's just a boy, my lord." Joffrey gave a savage grin. "That's right, a boy. I'll kill him. I'll kill all the Starks. Maybe I'll let the Hound bring me your precious brother's head. Then I'll—" He broke off in a sudden wave of nausea, leaning against the bedpost, retching. The stink of vomit filled the air. Sansa stayed rooted, stunned by the grotesque display of drunken violence. Then, with a shudder, Joffrey slumped to the floor, groaning. Minutes passed. He tried to stand but only staggered, half-conscious. "Leave me," he mumbled thickly. "Get out of my sight, you northern bitch." Sansa backed away, a swirl of dread and relief tangling inside her. She wanted to call for help, to have the servants clean up, but the memory of his strikes still burned her cheeks. Summoning her courage, she pressed the latch, knocking gently. The Kingsguard opened the door just enough to let her slip past. Neither knight looked her in the eye. They'd heard everything. One guard stared past her at the small pool of vomit in the corner, but said nothing. She fled down the corridor, numb with shock. A bruise throbbed on her cheekbone, matching the heat on her other cheek. The inside of her mouth tasted like blood. She had bitten down on her tongue to keep from crying out. She didn't stop until she reached her own chambers. There, she locked the door, pressing her back against it as her breath shuddered in and out. For a moment, she let the tears flow, face burning with shame and rage. He might kill her next time. She realized, with a sudden jolt, that she was truly no safer than before, maybe even in greater danger. The next time Joffrey got into a rage, there might be no drunken stumble to deflect him. She staggered to a mirror. In the lamplight, she saw the reddened handprints on her cheeks, new bruises forming. For an instant, her fury blotted out her terror. How dare he do this to her? She was a Stark of Winterfell, born of the line of kings in the north. He was just an inbred boy with illusions of grandeur. But illusions or not, he held power here. She was alone, in a castle full of watchers and whisperers. If she tried to kill him, she'd be cut down immediately. If she tried to flee alone, she'd be caught at the gates. She needed help. Help from Tyrion, from Marjorie, from Petyr, from whomever she could muster. She needed to act soon. Winterfell was so close to returning to House Stark. If Rickon truly held it, she had to survive until she could reach him or help him solidify his claim. The city was a powder keg, one more. A spark could set it ablaze. She spent a sleepless night planning, replaying the events of the feast, the humiliating dwarf mock battle, Joffrey's savage meltdown. By dawn, she was resolved. She would escape King's Landing. She did not know precisely how, but she felt certain she could no longer remain. Joffrey's mania would kill her before long. Cersei's threats would see her undone. If she waited for Tywin's return, that might close any last window of opportunity. She had to take a risk, trusting that the North's renewed strength gave her some chance of success. The question was who to trust, which ally's path would give her the best shot at survival, and not simply trade one captor for another. She rose at first light, splashing cold water on her face. Her cheeks still stung, but she found herself numb, prepared. She dressed in a simple gown of dark blue, something more practical than the ornate dresses she wore at court. She braided her hair tight against her scalp, slipping a small silver hairpin into place. It was no weapon, but perhaps it was better than nothing. Then, with her heart pounding, she sat at her desk and composed 3 short letters, one to Tyrion, one to Marjorie, one to Petyr. She wrote in guarded language, letting each know that she needed help leaving King's Landing, and that she would repay their discretion 1,000-fold in gratitude. She sealed them carefully with plain wax, not wanting to display the direwolf sigil for fear it might draw attention. Then she entrusted them to Danya, the maid who had once confessed her northern roots. Danya took the letters with solemn understanding, promising to deliver them privately and see that no one else read them. Now, all that remained was to wait for a response, and to keep Joffrey from growing suspicious in the meantime. Sansa spent the next 2 days in a haze of fear, going about her routine as if nothing had changed, smiling politely when forced to attend Joffrey in public, avoiding him whenever possible in private. The bruise on her cheek had darkened, prompting courtiers to murmur that she had fallen, or that she'd been accidentally struck in a crowd. Sansa neither confirmed nor denied. Cersei said nothing, though her cold glance suggested she guessed the truth. On the morning of the 3rd day, Danya slipped quietly into Sansa's solar, looking anxious but excited. "They answered, my lady," she whispered, handing Sansa 3 folded slips. Sansa's heart hammered as she tore them open one by one. From Tyrion, a short note. "I can arrange a distraction that might let you slip away. My man Bronn can see to it. Time is short. Let me know when you plan to move." From Marjorie, a more cautiously worded missive. "Though I cannot openly defy his grace, I know a traveling party soon leaving for Highgarden. If at some point you found yourself amongst them, I would ensure your safe passage, at least as far as the Reach. From there, you could pursue your own ends. Send word if you wish this course." From Petyr, a cryptic response. "The ladders are being set. Soon, the watchers at the gate will have something else to occupy them. Be prepared, little dove, to fly at short notice." Sansa reread the messages, her thoughts swirling. Each offered a different path out. Tyrion could create a distraction right here in King's Landing, though that would be dangerous for them both if discovered. Marjorie's plan gave her a route southward, away from the war, though it might strand her in the Reach, reliant on Tyrell goodwill, and far from Winterfell. Petyr's vague promise might whisk her away by ship, but she trusted him least of all. Still, each day that passed was another day she risked Joffrey's wrath. She set the letters aside, pressing her hands to her temples. She had to decide quickly. The city was a pressure cooker. At any moment, Joffrey might snap again, or the small folk might revolt, or news might arrive that Tywin was returning. She yearned for the north, for her family's seat, for the chance to stand with Rickon if he truly held Winterfell. But traveling from King's Landing to Winterfell would mean crossing hundreds of leagues of war-torn land or taking a ship around the coast, braving storms and pirates. And even if she reached White Harbor, House Manderley might or might not be secure. The road was fraught with perils. Yet was the alternative any better? Hiding in the Reach, forever looking over her shoulder? Or becoming indebted to Littlefinger, who saw her as a piece on his personal game board? A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Danya peeked in again. "There is a man at the servants' entrance. Says he has a token from Lord Tyrion. He asked me to give you this." She held out a small velvet pouch. Sansa opened the pouch, revealing a slender iron key. Attached was a scrap of parchment with a hurried scrawl. "At midnight tonight in the royal stables. Alone." So Tyrion wanted to move quickly. A key to the stables, likely. A horse or carriage readied for her. Her heart pounded. This might be a real chance to escape. But if she was caught, she or Tyrion could lose their lives. She weighed the notion of sending a quick note to Marjorie or Petyr, but time was short. Tyrion's plan might be the best immediate option. He had proven more openly kind than Petyr, and Marjorie's route to Highgarden would take more time to arrange. Meanwhile, Joffrey might not give her that time. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you, Danya. If you ever wanted to leave as well, I could." Danya shook her head vehemently. "I have family in the city, my lady. I can't leave them. I'll manage somehow." Sansa's chest tightened. "I understand. Then, if anyone asks, I've gone to bed early. And you saw nothing, you know nothing." Danya nodded, her eyes misting. She bowed quickly and left. The rest of the day crawled in agonizing slowness. Sansa pretended a headache to avoid mealtime with Joffrey. She felt half-sick with nerves. If all went according to plan, by the next sunrise she would be gone from King's Landing, where she would be in chains. She prayed to the old gods and the new for a measure of luck. As dusk fell, she changed into a simple cloak of dark fabric. Beneath, she wore riding leathers she had kept from her time at Winterfell, childhood clothes that were tight now, but still wearable enough to give her some freedom of movement. She braided her hair into a single plait down her back. She took no jewelry save her silver hairpin. Gold would only weigh her down, and it might attract thieves on the road. She packed a small satchel of essential items: a few pieces of bread and cheese, a water skin, a sewing kit, a small flint. In all her time at the Red Keep, she had never felt more frightened or more alive. She left her chambers near midnight, slipping past dozing guards who assumed the queen was Abed. The castle was oddly silent. The torches along the halls sputtered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Sansa's heart pounded so loudly she feared it would echo off the stone. Carefully, she made her way down winding stairwells toward the ground floor, hugging the walls whenever she heard footsteps. Twice, she ducked into an alcove to avoid passing guards. She could hardly believe she was actually doing this. After so many months of captivity, she was now gambling everything on Tyrion's promised distraction. At the final corridor leading to the stables, she caught a whiff of hay and horse sweat. The shadows flickered from a lantern hung near the stable door. Pressing herself flat against the wall, she inched forward to peer around the corner. 2 gold cloaks were stationed at the entrance. Were they always there? Her stomach twisted. Then, suddenly, a cry rose from somewhere deeper in the castle. A man's shout, followed by the clamor of steel. The guards stiffened, one turning as if to investigate. A second shout echoed, this one female, from a corridor off the main yard. "Thief! Treason!" More crashing, a loud clang, and then a series of urgent whistles. The 2 gold cloaks at the stable door bolted in the direction of the noise. Sansa seized the moment. She sprinted on silent feet into the stables. Within, the lantern light revealed row upon row of stalls, the horses snorting softly at her intrusion. She clutched the iron key, scanning for something that looked prepared. A single bay mare stood saddled near the end, a small pack strapped to its flank. "Sansa!" Came a low hiss from behind a support beam. Tyrion emerged, clad in a dark cloak, his face set. "Quickly, mount up. I have some men occupying the guards at the courtyard. It won't last. Go." Her hands shook as she approached the mare. Tyrion offered a stirrup and helped her mount. "Which gate?" she managed to ask, voice trembling. "Follow this alley behind the Dragon Pit stables. Bronn is there with a wagon. He'll guide you to a postern gate. He's bribed the watchman. Once you're out, head north if that's what you truly want, or south if you think it's safer. It's your choice." Her breath caught. "Lord Tyrion, thank you." He pressed a small pouch of coins into her hand. "You'll need it, and if you ever make it back to the north or wherever else fate leads, remember this. I did what I could." She felt tears threaten. "I won't forget," she whispered, "nor will I forget your kindness." Then, impulsively, she reached down and squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, his eyes reflecting a mix of relief, fear, and something like respect. "Now go," he said, stepping away. "Hurry." Sansa nudged the mare forward, wincing at the echo of hooves on stone. She guided the horse out the back of the stable, into a narrow passage behind the Red Keep's outer walls. The sound of commotion continued somewhere to her left. Men running, steel clanging, shouts about an intruder. Whatever Tyrion's men had staged, it was causing enough chaos to mask her escape. She pressed on, heart hammering so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. As promised, a small wagon waited in the shadows of an archway, drawn by a stout donkey. Bronn, Tyrion's Sellsword companion, lounged against it, wearing a hooded cloak. He lifted a hand in greeting. "Well, fancy meeting you here, your grace. Or should I say, not your grace for much longer." She forced a tense smile. "Open the gate, please. Let's be quick about it." His teeth flashed in a grin. "Straight to business. Good. That little ruckus in the courtyard won't hold their attention forever." He hopped into the wagon's driver's seat and flicked the reins. "Follow me, keep that horse close. Keep your head down." They proceeded at a cautious trot through winding passages rarely used by anyone but servants. They passed a pair of watchmen who said nothing, though Sansa noted Bronn toss a small pouch of coins toward one. The man caught it deftly, stepping aside to let them pass. She half expected an alarm to sound at any moment, to see a rush of gold cloaks swarm in front of them. But none came. The donkey's hooves clopped dully on the damp stone, echoing in the narrow confines. Finally, they reached a heavy wooden postern gate set into the outer wall. Another watchman stood there. Bronn halted the wagon, hopped down, and murmured a few words. The watchman nodded, fumbled with a ring of keys, and unbarred the gate. The massive wooden door creaked open, revealing a glimpse of the dark city beyond. Bronn beckoned Sansa forward. "Here we part ways. I've got to return this wagon or the ruse will be discovered too soon." He pointed into the night. "Go that way down the slope. It'll take you to the muddy banks near the Blackwater. Once you're free of the city, well, that's your problem. Good luck." She swallowed hard. "Thank you. I'm grateful." He shrugged. "I do what the halfman pays me to do, and I always collect." But the glint in his eye was not unkind. He closed the gate behind her with a deliberate clang, sealing her out of the Red Keep, the place that had been her gilded prison for so long. And just like that, she was outside. The night air was cooler, the stars obscured by wisps of cloud. She guided her mare down the sloping path, her pulse thrumming with both terror and exhilaration. The city's outer streets sprawled beyond, half illuminated by erratic torchlight. The stench of refuse and old smoke lingered. Most shops were shuttered. A stray dog barked in the distance. She had only her horse and the pouch of coins. No retinue, no armed guard, no illusions. She was alone, yet she was free. Keeping her head down, she nudged the mare into a slow canter, weaving through deserted alleys. Once she reached a wider street, she caught sight of the Blackwater rush to her left, glittering faintly under the moon. She followed it, mindful that the main gates would be heavily guarded. She'd have to find a lesser passage or cross the water to some farmland. The city's outskirts were a maze of taverns, warehouses, and broken fences. The fear of being caught spurred her on. At one point, she heard hoofbeats behind her and nearly panicked, but it was only a pair of drunken men on mules, singing a bawdy tune. She let them pass in a swirl of ale fumes, unnoticed. Closer to the old fish market, a few ragged figures huddled under eaves, eyeing her warily. She dreaded the possibility of cut purses, but none moved to stop her. Maybe they were too cold or too hungry to care, or maybe they sensed that the stables had turned out another desperate soul. It felt like hours before she finally reached a place where the wall's presence faded, and she could slip out onto a muddy track, stunted trees marking the edge of farmland. She pressed the mare onward, letting out a trembling breath. She had done it. She had escaped the Red Keep, slipping through the cracks of Joffrey's tyranny. She was still only a short distance from King's Landing, but every step away felt like a lifetime. She paused on a small rise, looking back. The city's silhouette bristled with towers. Flickers of torchlight dotted the walls. She thought of Tyrion, risking everything to help her. Of Marjorie, who might wonder where she had gone. Of Petyr, who had offered his own scheme. If they all realized she had taken Tyrion's route, they would either be relieved or furious. Joffrey would be enraged. Cersei would be beside herself with suspicion. But none of that mattered now. She was free with the open road ahead. And so she set her gaze northward, The wolf's blood in her veins called her home. Winterfell was far, the roads dangerous, but Rickon was there, if rumor held true. She had to believe in the possibility of reuniting with her last living brother and helping him secure their ancestral seat. The North needed every Stark it could muster. The thought steadied her. Nudging the mare forward, she let the city fade behind her. Dawn would come soon, and with it, a new chapter of her life, one shaped by her own choices rather than by the dictates of a cruel king. The night wind carried a promise of winter's chill, but to Sansa Stark, it felt like the first clean breath of liberty. She whispered a final prayer under her breath, urging the old gods and the new to guide her path, and rode onward into the waiting dark.